everyone. Thanks for joining us, and Thad, thanks for agreeing to speak with me. I'm very excited, a little intimidated by your Titanus work. But I wanted to start by starting from the beginning, which is a long time ago, but you just said something really interesting that makes me want to kind of fast forward to the show that we're in, and then we'll go backwards a little bit, if that's okay. And you were saying that you like to get here a day early, make sure everything's put together right. The work comes apart. You've described it as kind of Legos in the past, right? It comes apart so that it's easy to move. And there's one you were saying you were a little worried about.
But no, I'm saying I worry about them all in the sense of I don't know how stable they're going to be in a different environment. And I don't know if being that this is organic material and the wood, it comes from green logs and it expands and contracts and so forth. So from Pittsburgh to New York, from a cold basement to a very warm, big room, you never know if the fittings are going to be the same. But thanks to Steve and Karma, we have everything standing up. So.
So tell us what you mean by green wood. Does that mean fresh?
Well, those of you who live in a house where there's wood, well, that wood has been kiln dried. Mm-hmm. These are logs from a forestry sawmills in southwestern Pennsylvania. And they still have, depending on the time of year that they're cut down, they still have quite a bit of moisture in the wood. So preferably you'd like to get them in when most of the sap is out of them, which would be late November and early December. But I get them when I'm usually running out of logs.
Okay, and so you salvage your wood from sawmills and things like that, but are you getting scrap wood, or are you going to buy this log or that log?
Well, I'm very, depending on the time of my career, early on I just used what I could because I got the wood free, but more I carved, I got more discerning, I got more particular. So I ended up mostly doing what you see is either two types of wood, walnut or cherry.
Mm-hmm. Early on though, you weren't so picky about the type
I
of
wasn't
wood,
sure,
right?
but I got picky.
Okay, and walnut and cherry are hardwoods.
Yes.
And what difference does that make to the way the wood will, for example, hold the mark from your chisel?
Well, the hardwoods are best for anything like furniture, flooring, but the main thing for me is that the definition, and of course the colors of the wood, but also if you want to change textures, if you want to make sure you have people's eyes moving the way you want them to move, and particularly if you're going to worried about definition, you have to have hardwood.
Okay. Do you combine types of wood? Like, would this be all cherry or all walnut, or will you mix textures?
Well, it all depends on the shapes I want to make, depending on the log. This particular log, say in front of me, behind me and there, that's all walnut. The piece to the right, the bottom is cherry wood, and the rest of it is walnut. And you'll see some of the lighter texture, the lighter color. That's because you're getting to the sapwood, the outer part of the log.
Say that again. So you're getting out of the sap, and you're getting
up away from the heart of the log to the sapwood, which carries up the water to make leaves and so forth.
Okay. So if I understand correctly, this is all work that you've made since your last show here, right? So you've been extremely busy.
3 years. This is the product of 3 years of work. But some more things I've made they don't have out. maybe a dozen stools or so. But this is basically 3 years of large sculptures.
Well, so first of all, I feel like really unproductive.
Yeah.
But tell us, I've heard a lot, I've heard you talk a lot in other contexts about your daily practice. And so tell us how it's possible to make this much work in this time. How often are you in the studio? What is your studio routine?
Well, you know, I'm in the studio every day if I'm not here, you know. So and when I get up in the morning, after breakfast, the first thing I think about is going to work. And I go to work every day. And I always tell when I used to do residencies and have students, I said, well, you know, that inspiration is what should impel you. The first thing you got to do is go to work. And so basically that's what I do. I work every day. I look forward to seeing how things are going to turn out. And I think as I get closer to seeing an idea come to fruition, the more excited I get. You know, people say, aren't you excited about this? I said, no, I'm excited when I see a piece coming out the way I envision it. I don't do models and stuff like that. I just lay out the logs and I have the idea in my head. Sometimes I subtract, sometimes I add.
That reminds me of something you said to me the other day, which is your sculptures come to you in your mind's eye before you start working, which I find like just the most incredible thing. I said it reminds me of something that Anne Truitt has said before, though the work is very different. In wood, that's maybe the only connection, where she can see it first and then begin. But you have to work the wood, right? So do you see it first and then you find the wood that can make it, or do you see the log and then the log tells you?
Well, you know, I used to have maybe order 30 logs so at a time when I was a lot younger. But I don't order so many now because I don't see I'm going to have maybe 10 years of work coming up, being to my advanced age. But I ordered maybe, I have about 15, 20 new logs, and that's 6 or 7 sculptures. It's about at least a year and a half's work, also depending on the size and shape and so forth. But what I ordinarily do, I look at the logs every day, and this clicks. And I look at a major log and I say, what will go with it, you know? And I'll just sort of use this idea. I had this big log that sort of flared to the top. And I said, now what can I do? So I found a smaller log that I could drape over it. And that's, of course, it's not easy. You just don't drape over a log. You have to cut it and to fit over the log. So the problem was I don't have long arms, so I could only lift it up so high. So I have to get on the ladder and take it down and fit over. So then I wanted something to extend the height and something to change the shape. And I had some natural burls that I glued on front and back, and then I carved the thing at the top. And so that's usually the process.
Do you have anybody in the studio helping you, or are you solo?
I'm pretty much, I always say, this is a non-profit organization. No, I work pretty alone, but once in a while, there's a friend of mine, fellow artist, Bob Ziller, sitting back here. I had him come up and help me lift the top off, and but I had to make an adjustment because it was too tight on the right side coming down. But most of the time I'm there. I do everything myself. I have a small crane that I bought, I think when I was 82. I decided I needed a crane. I was lifting things by myself, which I still can lift pretty good. Believe it or not.
What can you lift? What's the big?
Well, that piece is sitting back with the holes and the shapes. I can still lift that, and
That's called panoramic quarter, right?
yeah. I used to be able to lift a lot more, but when I was young, people always asked me, "Did you study art in school?" I said, I grew up in Newcastle, Pennsylvania, and they didn't care much about art, but they cared a lot about football, basketball, and track. So I spent a lot of my early years trying to be an All-American, and I attribute my strengths from inheriting the strength, but also spending a lot of time running and pushing and jumping. So
But you were a basketball player for a while,
played
right?
basketball in junior high, ran track. I played semi-pro basketball until I was about 36. They don't have semi-pro anything anymore. But in the old days, they had a lot of it, People were TV and stuff, so,
So, yeah, I've heard you get described often as a self-taught artist, but by that means in your case, you didn't go to art school.
no.
But you maybe independently, not in school, but you studied art quite a lot, right?
Yeah, well, I say they make a great deal out of being self-taught. Mm-hmm. But I say everyone is really self-taught, You can only learn so much in any school, and you have to start thinking about your own practice, what you see, and your approach to what you want to do, whether it's someone else you're influenced by or a group of people you're influenced by. But in the end, you have to do it yourself, and mainly you should learn more than you learn in school. I mean, because you're going to be looking at it. I always said, I went to the University of Carnegie Museum, because I spent a great deal of time going at all the shows, looking at all what people were doing. And I always tell students, no matter where you go, see as much stuff as you can see, because that's the only way you're going to develop your own ideas. And in that sense, I meant that when I looked at things, people I admired, such as Noguchi and so forth, I said, well, how would I approach that same idea? Because all of us are individuals, and I don't care how well you can copy, you're not going to copy in the same way someone else has done the work.
Mm-hmm. I think that raises like an interesting question about the idea of influence, right? Influence implies a kind of directional relationship as opposed to like an absorbing of a set of ideas around weight and balance.
Well, I think influence is about empathy. I think both of us will look at something and say, gee, I think that's really an interesting art piece. Someone else will come along and says, I don't see anything in that, And so people who have the same ideas about sound or sight, well, we have that influence. And I think for me, some of the Noguchi things that he did, like Cronus with the paneled marble and stuff, what affected my ideas. I have a panel piece there because it doesn't look like Noguchi. It's not supposed to. But that is the idea where you get influence from. I had a great feeling for African tribal art. And one time I studied tribes according to what the piece was about, so what it was danced for and so forth. But the main thing was about the design of the piece and the shape and the rhythms and so forth, and how they were able to, what I call, abstract the expression. So I think that is pretty much the approach.
I've also heard you or read you talking about your interest in African art being related to the way in which often the work is, the objects are unique, right? Everything each time is distinct. And your way of manually impressing your mark into or finding the shape of the wood makes each sculpture unique. But I have a question about the relationship between the kind of unique object, finished object, and your process. So you talk about assemblage. Do you ever take them apart and see if they'd fit differently together?
No, because, well, as probably you can see in some of these things that, well, Steve can probably tell you better because he puts them together when they get here. And so he has to really think about figure out how they go. And he's done a tremendous job. But most things are only cut to fit into one situation, and they would just go with that piece. Yeah.
Okay, so they don't come apart again. Tell us a little bit more about what you are like, or what the studio practice is like. So you've got a lot of things in your studio, right?
Yeah.
It's a busy space, right?
Yeah.
But it's also sonically busy. You always have music on, right?
Well, unless I have a saw or something that drowns out the sound. But I usually have, if I'm just carving, I have some music on. I play music all the time, even in my house and sofa bedroom, but it doesn't influence what I do, enhances what I do. And the sounds joyful, makes me feel very good. If music doesn't make you feel good, you should be playing something else, unless you want to feel sad, But music to me is what I enjoy, and I've been around a lot, so great musicians. Pittsburgh produced tons of them, and a lot of them were my friends. Some of them were kids when I were young, and they got to be well known and so forth. Yeah, music is very important.
Does that factor in at all to the rhythm of the mark making that you have, or is it more, I don't know, abstract than that?
No, the gouge marks and things mainly come from the way African tribal art was made. And people have paid attention to that type of form, and the gouge marks or the chisel marks will, and particularly in my work, will lead you in a certain way or create another idea shape. Now, the piece that's right to the right, you'll see it will make it look like shingles. And then the opposite will to keep your eye from just shooting off into space, it'll ripple to the side and your eye will hopefully slide up the sculpture. But anyhow, it's about that sort of rhythm.
One thing that I find really remarkable, and actually makes it hard, I have this in front of me, which is the checklist, because if you take a picture of your work, it looks very different from one angle than if you walk around it, right? And what I'm always struck by how the sculptures seem to come apart in space and then come back together depending on the angle at which you approach them. And I'm curious if you're thinking about that kind of dynamic motion or the encounter when you're making the work.
Well, I always think about how it's going to look from all sides, and so I turn them around, and even in my studio, to see how this is going to work from another view, because I don't want it to look fragmented. I want to look like this shape plays off of another shape. Some things are straightforward, so like that small piece there. But these pieces that go on different angles, they should have the same dynamic on one angle as they have on another, in the sense of, sometimes people make sculpture or anything that only looks good from this angle, from the front. And I had people, when I used to teach and had students, they could not, this one person was trying to get in the show, and I told him, well, you're not going to get in the show. He says, well, I'm not changing the sculpture. I said, it doesn't matter to me. And he was surprised the juror didn't put it in the show. And she had the same critique as I had. All the emphasis was put on the one front side, and the other side, there was just blank wood. And he said, I thought that really looked good. I said, well, maybe if you don't move, it looks good, you know.
It's a bad comparison, but my grandmother always told me when you're getting dressed, you got to check yourself out from behind before you leave the house. Mm-hmm. The same. I want to move back a little bit to your life story, but the last, for the moment, kind of formal question I want to ask has to do with the finish. With there's a kind of skin-like quality that comes from the beeswax. I think it's beeswax, right?
Well, there's two different things. Early on, I used linseed oil and mineral spirits. Of course, oil, you have to keep putting it on in the dark. So then I start using polyacrylic. And that is the basic. But when you want to enliven a piece, or a piece that's been around for a while, I use I thought that was, I didn't turn mine off. But if you use, I used a product called Hardwoods. It's a combination of beeswax and orange oil, and it really works very well. Because that's another thing about hardwoods. You know, it takes finishes quite well.
And are you thinking about the way that, like, I mean, for me, when I look at some of the finishes on this piece in particular, which is maybe Bird of Time, but hard to tell from the angle that we're looking at.
This piece?
Yeah.
Okay.
The light plays off of, obviously, your chisel marks, but also the quality of the surface, right? That there's a kind of shine in certain places and dullness in others. Like, I love the way the light kind of traps in the negative space over here in the center of this piece. I'm just wondering if because I think there's so much emphasis on weight and space, but if you're also thinking about a relationship to light, its play on the surface, but also its function in the opening up of negative space in these works.
Well, the main thing is, like on a piece like this, is that it's about rhythm. And with hardwoods, you can carve crossways or diagonally or straight up, so the eye will sort of take off. Now, this piece is called airspace, or what is it called?
Oh, it's air step for Hayward. Yeah.
Oops, I think I've lost someone's stuff here.
I got it.
But anyway, my thoughts went away for a minute. But anyhow, this is like, I named it after the Nicholas brothers. A lot of people don't know who the Nicholas brothers were. But Fair Nicholas and Harold Nicholas were two of the greatest dancers this country ever produced. They came out of Philadelphia, brothers out of Philadelphia. But a lot of people never saw them because they were Afro-Americans. And they couldn't put them in the movies because they couldn't sell the movies down south and a lot of places in the north. But I always thought that Fair Nicholas particularly was one of the finest dancers. And I always remember his older brother, Harold, would say, people are always raving about Fred Astaire. He said, I'd like to see him dance against Fair. You'd see something. So Those of you who have never heard of Bayard Nicholas, try to get the old movie Stormy Weather, and you'll really surprise yourself. But this is about rhythm, shape, and your eye should sort of dance like a dancer moves. And I'm not saying that, it's not an illustration in that sense. It's an effect and an idea, and more or less an implication of what movement in space would be.
When you're thinking about titles, does it, like when you're thinking you're going to dedicate a work, is that once the work has kind of revealed itself, or do you go into it thinking, I'm going to make Sam Gilliam?
No, I don't name anything until it has to be shipped out. Because they're all for insurance and identification, because to me they're all about sculpture, all about shape. And titles don't mean a lot to me. The shape the sculptures mean. So I have to come up with something, and they're usually along the line of the piece itself, so I can go back to them. But there's a lot of people I admire. I have one piece that's in Pittsburgh in Chatham College space. It's called Long Leg Bait for Dylan Thomas. I love Dylan Thomas, particularly the rhythmic sound of his poetry. It's like music, sort of, in a way, because he had a voice that could deliver the word, But no, it's to me, I don't think you should really worry about what something is named more than what the piece looks like and how it affects your space and so forth.
Okay, so you studied English.
Yeah, I was an English journalism major. I studied to be a writer.
And you were a writer for a while.
Yeah, I did some writing, but not real writing.
What does that mean?
Well, there are writers who, what I did sports and stuff like this, and who, what, where, and why, and that sort of thing. But I never penetrated into deep reasoning about ideas. And there's that, to me, when you can do that, there are certain people that do factual writing. Well, one thing, years ago I bought a book called These Truths. It's a book by Jill Lepore about American history. And I think that's writing.
Okay. So you were doing it, but not necessarily, you didn't necessarily think that it was going to be your long career. How did you come to sculpture? At what point?
Well, I came to sculpture. Well, I always sort of liked art, and I was fortunate enough the Carnegie Museum is across the street from the University of Pittsburgh. So I had a friend that was a painter, and when I wasn't that much interested in art, but we used to I used to go over with him and look at the internationals in the late 40s and the early 50s, and I saw probably every Carnegie International since the 50s. So,
Do you have a favorite?
No, well, it changed the idea changed according to directors, but one of the best shows was when they started making it into groups. They would have maybe like David Smith do a section, Noguchi do a section, and that sort of thing. And that was one of the more interesting segments among my years of the international. But to see an international show is always interesting, whether it's what your cup of tea or not.
Okay, so you're going to the international. You're looking at art with your friends. there's a big leap. I mean, I go to museums all the time. I work at one. I've never made the leap to trying to make something. I know better than.
Well,
than
you
that,
don't never know, you know.
But how did you? I mean, I've heard this story that you were looking at some Scandinavian furniture and thought I could do that better. But, you know.
No, what I did, I looked at Scandinavian furniture, and I noticed in the brochures, they always had some kind of sculptures or decorative pieces with the sculpture, where in America, if you looked at a brochure on furniture, you saw nothing but a blank wall. And so in Sweden, in those places, the art with the furniture was very important. And I said, and they had fish and birds and stuff like that. And I looked at those, I said, I can make those. You know, and also, of course, most people look at stuff and say, well, my kid can do better than that. But I said, well, I can do that. So I started, but whereas I did teak wood and stuff like that, very thin stuff, I got 2x4s and very fat stuff. So.
And were you making figurative things at that point? I mean, were they
Oh
birds
yeah,
and
I
fishes?
started out making heads and figures, which some I still have, and I think Terry has a head from about 1959 or 1960. She bought it on eBay sometime. So someone called me and said, "Oh, one of your old pieces are on at the TV." And of course, I don't have computers and stuff. So she said, do you think I should buy it? I said, if you want it. You know, so she bought it, and I have a figure, one of the figures in my bedroom from about that time. And I started out making heads and figures because it's like anything, if you're going to start something, you want to start something you're familiar with, something you can understand. You can understand a head or a body because you got one, right? So rather than starting with an abstract idea, because very few people start out thinking abstractly, you know, but you can start out. You can make a bird or a fish shape or something like that. So I used to, when I taught, try to encourage people to start with some familiar thing they saw in the log, you know.
And how long, I mean, how soon after you started did you feel comfortable enough to move to kind of a more abstract language?
Well, about 3 years.
Okay.
Yeah, about 3 years. Because I'd been looking at stuff anyhow.
Right.
So it's easy to steal an idea that you like and make it different from what someone else made, you know. So about 3 years I got into the very abstract, and I think maybe it was about after about that time, the director Carnegie at that time saw what I was doing, and he said, you know, I really like what you're doing. And so from that time on, I kept on. I was making smaller things, nothing this size, because a lot of times I was working in small spaces.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, you had kids too, right? They take up a lot of room.
Yeah.
Hard to imagine negotiating these as well. So you had a big show at the Carnegie, right?
Yeah.
A lot of interest in it.
Pardon?
You had a lot of interest in it. You had dealers from New York coming up and asking you to come to New York and do shows, and you said no, right?
Well, no, what I had was a couple of gallery people at that time were interested in me, and they wanted me to move to New York, and they wanted me to do 2 shows at once and all like that, and I had my children and so forth, and I said, oh, you can't. I I said, maybe if I transfer and get a job, I was in the postal service at the time. He said, you can't have a job. And I said, well, no one said, who's going to take care of my children beside me? I said, no, I'm not going, you know. I'm not that ambitious about making a name in art. I want to make art, but I wasn't that. So I've always felt, you know, that, you know, a lot of people, I know people who say, well, when my kid get out of college, he's going to pay me back. You know, but I've always felt that you owe your children, they don't owe you, you know. And so particularly, I wanted to see that the things that I recognize college life as growing up and maturing, that sort of experience, becoming a universal or cosmopolitan person, to me can only be achieved through a college experience. And so that was the type of thing I wanted my children to. I know a lot of people, well, they can go to this kind of school, they can go to a local trade school or something. Well, that to me was not a maturing, revealing experience. And I think I think anyone that has experienced college life or university life, hopefully it expanded your horizons. Hopefully it made you see beyond your neighborhood and so forth. So I think all my children have achieved that.
Do you feel like staying in Pittsburgh had an impact on the way that your work has formally evolved? In other words, has obviously your wood is literally from Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
But how else might place be centered in this work or exist in it?
Well, like I said, I think most of the art I saw in that time was at Pittsburgh and Youngstown, the Butler art places. Those are the main places I saw. But the art came from all over the world. So it wasn't like that, I saw what was coming up in Pittsburgh. And that is another idea of the museum. At that time, all the museums were free. You didn't have to pay to go. So all of us would spend a great deal of time going to the Carnegie, looking at the permanent collection, which I do sometimes now. If I'm really tired, I say, well, I'll take off and go out and look at the old stuff, Whistler and all those people. And there's always something that new that you see that was old, you know.
I like the idea of the repeated encounter, right? Like old friends, new friends, they look different when you see them over time. So you've just been working this whole time, right? So that's basically what you're telling us is you said, I'm going to stay in Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
I want to keep making. We know you have this incredible habit of being in the studio for 8-9 hours a day.
Well, when I was younger, all depended, sometimes 12. I had strict regimen for my children, you know, like when they got out of school, he can tell you they had from 3 to 7 was home, dinner and homework. And after that, from 7 to 10, they could pretty much do. 10 o'clock was bedtime. And by that time, I'd be back home from the studio. On the weekends, I worked 10 or 12 hours a day back in those days, you know.
It's a huge volume, though, since we know you're prolific. We know this is just a couple of years.
This is 3 years. Mainly, there's some other stuff, maybe 10, a dozen or so schools. But, you know, you have to want to do it. You know, it's not going to happen. if you're saying, oh, I don't feel like doing anything today, you know, you're not going to make any art.
And were you living with all of the things that you were producing? I mean, obviously some of it's going out into the world, but
Oh, yeah.
where does it go?
There's got to be maybe 50 sculptures in my little house. Not all of them mine, but most of them, the big pieces are mine. You know, it's like my company, my friends. It's why I started making art, making it for myself. I wanted it in my living room, my bedroom, dining room, and so forth, you know. So people who have been to my house, there are a few, they would tell you that I always say I have two studios, one I live in and one I work in. It's all about the same thing. It's about surrounding yourself and your life with what you really like, you know. And you don't look for social approval. I remember I had a show in a gallery in Pittsburgh, and my mother was still alive, and they called me Junior because I'm named after my father. She said, well, Junior, if you don't sell those two things, I want them. I said, okay, Mom. She lived in Akron, so I drove them over there, and my older sister took care of her. So I came by a couple months later, and I said, B, what happened to the sculptures I gave to Mom? She says, well, her friends laughed at them so hard, she put them behind the couch. So, you know, so the difference is I wouldn't care how loud my friends laughed. That's okay, because I liked the pieces. So I end up, my youngest sister took some when she passed away, but you know that's personal taste.
Well, I'm gonna maybe ask you one more question, then we can turn it over to the audience. But you're talking about a pretty solitary kind of practice, and we know you're in your studio mostly alone, which is amazing when you think about something like Industrial Collage, which is this incredible piece with this salvaged steel element. So just incredible that you're making that on your own. But you have surrounded yourself for your entire life by a community of artists. So what has that given you, and how has being in that community and being in dialogue with other artists supported or sustained you in this?
Well, I think unfortunately most of them
Don't
no longer around, you know. But then I'm around a lot of young artists also, and younger artists. But the main thing, I think artists, of course, in Pittsburgh at one time, they had a lot of art organization, and that sort of attributed to my education also. I was in the Society of Sculptors, the abstract group, and Associated Artists is one of the oldest art groups in America. I think it's about 110 years old or something like that. So we had an annual show at the Carnegie, and there were all these people doing art locally, and they still are. So, you know, and when I was younger, I used to go to almost every opening to see what everyone was doing, and we had that fellowship, and I think we still do. I'm just not as much involved as I was. But I think, but also with us, we had a group of people that were crazy about jazz, and at that time they had a lot of clubs. So we all hung, with many things we'd all, when Coltrane, Miles Davis, whoever would show up, they would be in town for a week or 2 weeks. We'd go almost every night. I think I must have heard Coltrane play about 20 times or more. So, so it was about not only had to do with art, but had to do with life, a lifestyle, and that nourished your sense of what creativity was. And I think that is probably the most important element about being an artist. If you don't have a lifestyle that provides creative nourishment, you're not going to make a lot of art, you know.
Maybe not a lot that anybody wants to look at. So, thank you. That's a beautiful way to sum up a way to be in the world and a way to make in the world. Does anybody have any questions for? We'll just take a few. Yes, but you have to be loud.
Yeah, you talked about the role that music has while you're making art. I was wondering what music you were listening to. You mentioned jazz.
Well, I also, I grew up with mainly two types of music, mainly symphony and jazz. My oldest sister, if you're going to learn to play, if you take music lessons, you have to pretty much learn on first how to play what people call classical music, scales and chords and all that. So my mother was a musician. She played piano. My father played trumpet. My oldest sister was the best musician in our family and a fabulous singer. So we heard music all the time. I had 4 sisters and me, and all my sisters took piano lessons. I didn't take, but I learned to play some by ear. But only 2 could really play. So but there's always a lot of music, and I once in a while go to symphony, like when with a young man that's Daniel Tripp, I forget his last place, a lot of Rachmaninoff. I've heard him a couple of times at the symphony, and Sophie Mutter, and a lot, you know. And one thing, when I was in school, the symphony hall was next door to Pitt, and they would, when they had dress rehearsals, they'd invite the students over free, so they would have people play, you know. So I took advantage of all that. But so I listened to lots of music, and there's a lot of musicians in my neighborhood at the time. I lived in the middle of the hill, and the Crawford Grill, and the Hurricane. So I listened to I heard all the great jazz people.
Anybody else?
Tell us about your experiences at Touchstone Center and teaching students. What's teaching people like?
Well, Touchstone Center for the Arts, most people know where Falling Water is. They've heard of Falling Water. So it's down there. I taught down there about 28 summers. That was my summer vacation. And of course, I always say, I never had a student that didn't make something, because my approach to teaching wasn't that you made what I wanted you to make, because most teachers have a plan. Everyone paints a rose, everyone paints a head. No, my idea was that, what do you see in this piece of wood? Well, okay, I don't see anything. Okay, so we're gonna take some chalk. I always took chalk because I use it myself, because it's easy to remove. If you have a marker or paint, you can't take that off, it's on there. So you keep doing something. Well, okay, I don't see anything. Look at a log till you find something that gives you a spark. So from that spark, I would teach, and I taught. And everyone made something. A lot of people came back year after year. I did the same thing at Carnegie Mountain, because I used to go in at the start of the school year with the dean and said, okay, now most of you in this class would know how I tell you drawing and models are so important. He said, we have a man here today that doesn't do any of that. And he's going to show you how he does it. So that was my method of teaching. And so I found that I enjoyed teaching that way, and most people learned how that if you make a cut one way, you can make one another way. It doesn't matter, you know. And you don't have to do something that someone wants you to do. Any other questions?
We can take one more, yeah.
What's in your toolbox?
What you say?
What's in your toolbox?
Oh, I don't have a toolbox. I have a mass collection of all kind of gouges and chisels and mallets. That's those have seen pictures of my studio and taking pictures of the layout of the tools. There's many tools. Some of them are triple in the sense that I have 3 of this, 3 of that, 3 of that. And the reason I have that because I don't have to stop and sharpen. I can go right to the next tool if I'm really working.
Yes.
Do you sketch on paper or anything, some of your ideas initially, or
Uh,
just let the
well,
material
The only time I do that, if there's a commission, because people won't take my word that I can do it.
Everybody's nervous, right?
Well, everyone doesn't have the same confidence in me as I have in myself. Because my thing is someone, can you do this? Yeah, I can do it. I've always had that confidence. Yeah, I can do it.
Well, that's how you started, right? You could do it
Oh, yeah.
better than those Scandinavian. Yeah. So, anybody?
Yeah, I know that you've had friendships with a number of artists, and I think Carl Dingbat Smith was a very particular kind of artist in the same way that you are a very particular kind of artist, and also Sam Gilligan. Can you talk about your relationships with those or other artists?
Well,
And what that does for your work?
Well, I think with Sam and some other people, I think that the fact that that they became friends with me and we enjoyed each other's company as well as we appreciated each other's art. And when you have admiration for someone, not only for their work, for them as a human being, I think that's extremely encouraging. And I just think everyone, if someone you really admire can say, well, I like what you're doing, well, I think that's a big pat on the back and a big encouragement. And I always remember the artists he's talking about, they said, oh yeah, you're doing great, keep at it. And well, one of the recent things, I went to see Alex Katz's show at the Guggenheim. And so when I got home, I sent him a note, saying what a great show it was. And he sent me back a card and said, Dad, keep doing great things. So, that's sort of makes you feel good, but it doesn't get the work done. You got to go and do it,
Well, the two of you are both incredibly busy still.
Yeah, and we're both near, I'm about a year older than he.
Well, I think we'll be here, but we'll call that for the formal portion. Thank you.